Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Jared Pratt, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 2, Donna Haig. 75 years ago, Japan's formal surrender took place in Tokyo Bay, Japan, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, followed by surrender ceremonies across Asia and the Pacific. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's acceptance of the Allies' terms and Japan's unconditional surrender on the 15th of August. Nazi Germany had surrendered to the Allies 3 months earlier. The Second World War was over. The most destructive conflict in human history. For Australia, the conflict lasted 6 years. Defeat of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and the expansionist militarist Japan came at a heavy cost. At least 60 million people died. Tens of millions were displaced, and areas of Europe, Asia, and the Pacific were devastated. Almost 1 million Australians served, over half of whom saw service overseas. 40,000 Australian servicemen and servicewomen died in the conflict, and more than 30,000 suffered as prisoners of war, while 1,500 Australian civilians were interned by the Japanese in Asia and the Pacific. Tens of thousands of Australians were wounded or injured. Moral injuries were uncounted. Through these painful events and the sacrifices made by individuals, we remain mindful of our history, but not held hostage to it. Today, we pay our respects to the 40,000 Australian men and women who died as a result of their service during the Second World War, and who are commemorated here on the Roll of Honour, and to the survivors who returned home. We're honoured to acknowledge His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, and Her Excellency Mrs. Linda Hurley. His Excellency Mr. Rei Ichiro Takahashi, Ambassador of Japan to Australia, and Mrs. Mahasako Takahashi. His Excellency Mr. Arthur B. Culverhouse Jr., Ambassador of the United States of America to Australia, and representatives from the British High Commission. We're also honoured to welcome Mr. John King, President, Returned and Services League of Australia, ACT branch, Mr. Alex McGowan, Naval Association of Australia, ACT section, representatives of the Battle for Australia Association, and students from St. Thomas More Primary School, Campbell, in the ACT. We also give a specially warm welcome to Mr. Les Cook, a Second World War veteran who served in the Australian Army in theatres from North Africa, the Mediterranean, through to North Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those who are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors to the memorial. If able, please stand for the Australian National Anthem.
Our home is the
If able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection in the following order. His Excellency, General the Honourable David Hurley, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, and Her Excellency, Mrs. Linda Hurley. His Excellency, Mr. Reiichiro Takahashi, Ambassador of Japan to Australia, and Mrs. Masako Takahashi. His Excellency, Mr. Arthur B. Culverhouse Jr., Ambassador of the United States of America to Australia. Commander David Salisbury, Naval Advisor, on behalf of the British High Commission. Mr. Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. Mr. John King, President, Returned and Services League of Australia, ACT Branch. Mr. Alex McGowan, Naval Association of Australia, ACT Section. Air Vice Marshal Roxley McLennan, representing the Battle for Australia Association and St Thomas More Primary School students. Members of the public, the Malay reads.
Today we will remember and pay tribute to Major George Norman Strachan Campbell. George Campbell was born in the Melbourne suburb of Melbourne on the 19th of April 1896, the son of George and Clara Campbell. After attending Melbourne Grammar School, Campbell studied medicine at the University of Melbourne. He put his studies on hold, however, when he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 2nd of March 1916 at the age of 19. He joined the Australian Army Medical Corps, working at a clearing hospital in Maribyrnong, and then after sailing to Egypt, at hospitals in Alexandria and Abbasia. He also had a stint with the 2nd Light Horse Field Ambulance in mid-1918. Campbell suffered from a range of illnesses during his service, at various times contracting influenza, parotitis, severe fever and malaria. After returning to Australia in January 1919, he gave up his medical studies because of recurrent problems with malaria. He took up land as part of the soldier settlement scheme, but, like many others, was unsuccessful. Instead, he went into business as a broker and commercial organiser, initially in Tasmania, later moving to Melbourne. Campbell married Alison Webb Burbage on the 7th of February 1923. 4 years later, he was appointed the organising secretary for the Victorian War Memorial Appeal Fund, an influential and very public position that would see him raise funds to establish Victoria's Shrine of Remembrance. He became a member of the Old Melburnian Society, a supporter of the United Australia Party, and was regularly featured in society pages of the press. Campbell continued to serve with the Australian Army Service Corps and steadily rose to the ranks, promoted to lieutenant and then captain. On the 29th of March 1931, a daughter, Anne, was born to the Campbells. With the event of the Second World War, George Campbell, now 43 years old, was mobilised with the Australian Army Service Corps. In February 1941, he was seconded to the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. Now with the rank of Major, he was appointed Commanding Officer of the 2nd 3rd Motor Ambulance Convoy. As Campbell's unit left Australia with other elements of the 8th Division, the talk on board centred on the possibility of action against the German and Italian forces in North Africa. But the men soon learned that they would not be travelling to Egypt. With the threat of the Japanese aggression bringing the war closer to home, the 8th Division was instead sent to Malaya. The Japanese invasion was swift and ruthlessly effective. British forces defending the Malay Peninsula were driven south in a relentless but short campaign. By the end of January 1942, the Allied forces had retreated to Singapore Island, and just over a fortnight later, Singapore was forced to capitulate. The speed and ease of Japanese victory over what was supposed to be an impregnable fortress stunned those at home in Australia. Over 130,000 troops, including 15,000 Australians, were surrendered to the Japanese. almost 1,800 Australians had been killed during the 8th Division fighting in Malaya in mid-January. Far more would die during captivity. Initially imprisoned in the now notorious Changi jail, it wasn't long before the men were divided into workforces to labour on the Burma-Thailand Railway. A-Force was the first Australian group to leave Singapore for Burma on the 14th of May 1942. Campbell was part of the next group, B-Force, consisting of almost 1,500 prisoners of war who were transported from Changi on the 7th of July 1942 on board the tramp ship Ubi Maru. The men of B-Force were sent to 4 main camps in Borneo, of which Sandakan contained the most Australians. At first, the prisoners were treated reasonably well, but rations began to reduce as beatings increased. By late 1944, with Allied forces advancing towards Borneo, groups of Australian and British prisoners were sent on a forced march west to Ranau. Many died on the way. Their bodies were never recovered. Those unable to continue were killed. Those too weak to march had been left behind, where all died or were murdered. Only 6 Australians sent to Ranau survived the war. Major George Campbell died on the 2nd of September 1945 at the age of 49. Today, his remains lie buried in Labuan War Cemetery. His name is listed on the roll of honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Major George Norman Strachan Campbell, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
If able, please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you all for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.